You may have heard of Huawei smartphones, but you probably haven't heard of their PCs, and that's because they really only had one released last year. Now they're back in 2017 with the Matebook X, and this is a super high-end computer that's targeting some of the best, like Apple's MacBook and the Asus ZenBook 3. Question is, can this newcomer defeat those veterans? Let's find out. Now, as mentioned, this is a super thin and light system, and that means it's half an inch thick, weighs about 2.3 pounds, and that really makes it among the thinnest and lightest notebooks around. Now, it's got a 13-inch class display, and that puts it right in line with 12-inch Apple MacBook and Asus ZenBook 3. Both those systems are about as thick, and they weigh just slightly less at about 2 pounds, not enough that you really notice the difference. Now, this laptop, being so thin, does have the potential to have some pitfalls like ports, and indeed you're looking at two USB Type-C ports, one on each end. However, that is one more than you get with the Apple MacBook or the Asus ZenBook 3, so it actually does kind of best its competitors there. Another thing that's really great about the Matebook X is the keyboard. Now, thin systems like this usually have to compromise on the key travel because they are so thin, there's not a lot of room for the keys to depress. But Huawei's actually managed to get around that problem. The keyboard travels about as much as thicker laptops do, and when you actually use it, it really feels like a thicker laptop. If you were blindfolded and started to use the keyboard, you probably wouldn't notice the difference. Another high point for the Matebook X is the display. Now, it's got a 3:2 form factor display, which is pretty uncommon on a Windows PC. And it actually makes the most of a smaller laptop like this. It provides a lot of room for doing productivity, viewing documents, and viewing web pages because you have more vertical space here. The screen also did really well in our color accuracy test and our color gamut test. It looks very vibrant, but also not overblown or kind of fluorescent when displaying bright colors. The contrast is just okay, and that's probably the weakest point of the display. But overall, you're looking at a screen that's just very attractive and good to use in day-to-day life. Compared to something like the MacBook, it's probably not quite as vibrant as that. Apple's displays are really spot on in how they produce color. However, compared to other Windows PCs in this category, like the Asus ZenBook 3, definitely has an advantage. It's got good, sharp, high resolution, great color accuracy that beats most of its competitors. Now, thin systems like this can have trouble packing in a fast processor, but the Matebook X mostly gets around that. It does have a Core i5 dual-core processor, and that's the standard Core i5 series, a Core i5 7200U specifically in our review unit. Now, that's pretty good, and in our performance test, it did well enough, although when you compare this to a thicker laptop with the same processor, you will notice this is slightly slower in the benchmarks. And that's going to be because of the thermal design. There's not as much room here to get rid of excess heat. It does tend to drag it down just ever so slightly over extended periods of high processor use. Frankly though, in day-to-day use, you're probably not going to notice that. And something you will like is the hard drive, which proved to be quite quick in our tests. It did about 1,200 megabytes per second write, which isn't a record setter by any means, but for this sort of laptop, this size of laptop, it's quite respectable. One downside that Huawei has not been able to get around with a laptop of this size is the battery. You get a 41.4 watt-hour battery in this. And for comparison, that's actually the exact same size as the 12-inch Apple MacBook. But if you look at something like the Dell XPS 13, that is a 60 watt-hour battery. It's a lot bigger. And even if you count efficiency improvements for the system, it's just not going to get as long a life as something that has such an advantage in battery capacity. Now, to be precise, we tested this at 1080p video loop, and it got about 9 hours. Now, something that's a thicker system is going to get around 11 hours in most cases. However, now remember, this is really competing against other super thin systems like that Apple MacBook and like that Asus ZenBook 3. So you compare it to those, and those systems get about the same battery life. And I also think a lot of people probably will find that 9 hours of video loop to be just fine. So it's certainly not a blunder in terms of battery life, but if you really, really want to have your system last forever, you're going to need to get a system that is a bit bigger. So it sounds great, right? Seems like a laptop that has all its bases covered. But there is a problem, and that is the pricing. Huawei has not given the final US price for this system. They have told us the price is going to be equal to or less than the European price, which is 1,400 euros. That's about 1,500 US dollars. That's a lot of money. It's more than its competitors. It's more than Apple Macbook or an Asus ZenBook 3, which starts at $1,000. So you can start to see where the problem is. We like this laptop a lot, but not enough to pay, hundreds of dollars more than its competitors. Now, if Huawei comes in at around $1,200, we think that'd be a sweet spot. That'd be a really good value for this system. But if it's more than that, not so much. We'll just have to wait and see what Huawei's final US pricing is before we make the final determination.